Hello everyone, please stay tuned and our session will start in a few minutes. Hello everyone, please stay tuned and our session will start in a few minutes. Hello everyone, please stay tuned and our session will start in a few minutes. Hello everyone, please stay tuned and our session will start in a few minutes.
The precious things that have always been around now disappeared. Quieter, slower, cleaner.
Hello everyone, please stay tuned and our session will start in a few minutes.
But this is anxiety. The precious things that have always been around now disappeared. Quieter, slower, cleaner.
Hello everyone, please stay tuned and our session will start in a few minutes.
But this is anxiety. The precious things that have always been around now disappeared.
Hello everyone, please wait for us for a few minutes. We will fix it, the technical error now. Hello everyone, please wait for us for a few minutes. We will fix it, the technical error now. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Shinhan Academy Seed the Future Season 3, an entrepreneurship education program organized by Shinhan Futures Lab, and our co-organizers are Shinhan Bank and Saigon Innovation Hub. My name is Lanang, and I'm the Innovation Manager from Shinhan Futures Lab, and it's my pleasure to see you all again today. Last Wednesday, we have a session on venture capital and fundraising strategy with Dr. Robin Klingler-Vitra from King's College London. And today is my honor to invite Mr. Andrew Rowan to join with us for the session, Vietnamese startup, go national or regional. So Andrew Rowan is an American entrepreneur who has lived and worked in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, and Then Ang since 2013. And as the founder and director of GKTA Group, he established the partnership with the Finland-Vietnam Innovation Partnership Program, IPP, which accelerates growth for startups originating in Vietnam with support from the government of Vietnam and Finland. He's also a leading expert on entrepreneurship, startup, and economic development. Andrew has collaborated on innovation initiative in Vietnam with the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi, as well as Vietnam Ministry of Science and Technology. He is an author of the book Startup Vietnam, Innovation and Entrepreneurship in a Socialist Republic, and the host of Planetary Potential. So as Andrew has been in Vietnam since 2013 for the early days of the startup ecosystem, and he has a lot of experience in terms of startup and entrepreneurship in many developing markets. So please take this chance today to learn from his experience and insights. And for the attendees, if you have any questions during the presentations, just feel free to let us know via the chat room or in the Q&A section. And now I won't let you wait any longer. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Andrew Rowan.
Xin chào các bạn, tên tôi là Andrew. Các bạn cũng có thể gọi tôi là Andy hoặc là Anh. Tôi là người Mỹ từ New York, nhưng bây giờ tôi ở Mexico. Tôi tung sống ở Việt Nam, tôi tung sống ở Sài Gòn, Hà Nội và Đà Nẵng. Tôi là tác giả của Startup Vietnam, Innovation and Entrepreneurship in the Socialist Republic. Và bây giờ tôi sẽ nói tiếng Anh. Xin cảm ơn. So, first of all, let me thank Ms. Lan Anh, and I'm going to share my screen for the presentation. Great. Okay, so before I start, I want to make a disclaimer. I'm going to be sharing my opinions. They don't represent any organization, so they are solely my own opinions. Thanks to Ms. Lan Anh's wonderful introduction, I'm going to be covering, again, briefly my background and experience. I want to define some terms so that we're all on the same page and talk to you about Vietnam as a brand. What's the perception basically that people have about Vietnam when they think of Vietnam? What's the first thing that they think of? Vietnam today, it's certainly in a different place than it was 5 years ago. And the topic is going national or going regional. So I'm hoping to give you some context so that you can decide for yourself. So I hope you didn't join today looking for one answer or the other. As we wrap up, I would like to cover some takeaways, and then of course also leaving you with some ways that you can get involved with the local startup community and also the international community that has an interest in Vietnam, especially as it relates to innovation, entrepreneurship, and startups. So my first visit to Vietnam was in 2011. And at the time, I was part of a team working on a systems integration project. I was in Saigon for 3 weeks, and I was really struck by the energy, the electricity, and the excitement that I could feel in the streets there. And I remember thinking that I had to move back one day. And so I did 2 years later, and I worked to implement part of the design that I'd come up with in 2011. And that's the time where I had the opportunity to meet with entrepreneurs, both local and foreign, who were in Saigon. And I had the opportunity to ask them some pretty direct questions. For example, how do you deal with the bureaucracy, and how do you get your first customer if you're a foreigner and you don't speak Vietnamese, right? And you're targeting a Vietnamese demographic. And I received some good answers and some honest answers, but it was all very helpful for me to better understand the operating context, especially as a foreigner, as a guest in Vietnam, in the sense of figuring out what I could and couldn't do there. And so I ended up spending my first Christmas in Hanoi in 2013. That was my first of 5 Christmases overall in Vietnam. And I was really impressed by my Christmas experience in Hanoi. At the time, I had the opportunity to join the Zone 9 on the very last evening. If you had been there, and it was this kind of Paris meets Berlin meets New York in the middle of Hanoi. And I was really intrigued because at the time there wasn't any space like that in Saigon. And so I was wondering, you know, why is this space here in Hanoi and not in Saigon? And for whatever reason, most of my social circle in Saigon were Hanoians. I was living with a Hanoian at the time, hanging out with Hanoians. And I decided to move to Hanoi in 2014 after I had wrapped up the project in Saigon. And after I tried to do a startup myself in Saigon, which didn't work out, mostly due to co-founder friction at the time. So I ended up living in Hanoi until about 2017, when I decided, okay, so I saw the kind of Southern style and the Northern perspective. I wanted to also better understand the Central style, because there's a very different way of doing things, both in the North and the South, and in particular, Saigon and Hanoi. And I had visited Da Nang very briefly in 2013. And so I ended up being based there for a little bit to better understand what's unique about the city. Da Nang, for example, you know, the city has features that neither Hanoi nor Saigon have. You have a river, you have the sea, you have mountains, all within 20 minutes of each other, and clearer skies usually. So it's great for biking, which is one of my great loves in life. And I also had the opportunity to train some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I enjoyed, and I miss training, especially during the quarantine experience at the moment. So at the same time, when I moved to Hanoi is when I started working more with public sector programs like the Finland-Vietnam Innovation Partnership Program. I started writing about what I was observing in Vietnam exclusively for foreigners, because I remember how frustrated I was when I got to Vietnam, and I tried to make sense of what I saw, what people were telling me. And so I started writing about developments, trends, as it related to innovation, entrepreneurship, and startups in E27, Tech in Asia, TechWire Asia, for example. And I realized that there was a big disconnect between the perception of Vietnam and modern Vietnam, you know, what was happening on the streets in Vietnam, as opposed to what people are talking about in, for example, the US, right? And so when I would go back to the US, I would have interesting conversations with people, and they would refer to Vietnam's history in the 20th century, obviously aspects between the US and Vietnam. And I could see that, you know, that wasn't the case in any city in Vietnam. So that's why I decided to write a book, Startup Vietnam, to help update the outdated perceptions and to correct some misperceptions about what was happening in modern Vietnam. And the book came out last year. So I've gone to different events as an invited speaker or panelist, for example, in Egypt, talking about what was happening in Vietnam. And I realized that there were quite a bit similarities in the challenges. I can dive into a bit deeper in the presentation. Last year, I was invited by Swiss EP, which is a program sponsored by the Swiss government to work with community development and share some of the lessons learned from my experience in Vietnam. And the timing was great in the sense that for the first time, a Vietnamese startup won the World Startup Cup Challenge, and that was Abivid. And I happened to be there, and it was a clear sign that now people were starting to notice the talent coming out of Vietnam. While I was in Peru, I launched a podcast called The Planetary Potential. So season 1 features 20 episodes, 20 interviews with founders, investors, and entrepreneurs, talking about how they started, what are some of the challenges, and where they see opportunities as they look to expand out of Peru. Season 2 is on Vietnam, and that's halfway recorded. And season 3 is on Mexico, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. Currently based here in Mexico. The wave of the pandemic is supposed to peak in about a week. So we're behind the US, which is behind Italy, which is behind parts of Asia. I'm very happy to see that things are starting to open up again in Vietnam. And I'm going to talk a bit about that a bit later in the presentation. And here is a photo, one of the photos that I took of my trip to Saigon in 2011. And this is from the Russian market, the building that houses the Russian market. And it'll be interesting to see 10 years. So next year, it'd be great to take the same photo and see all the changes in a decade. Okay, so in terms of definitions, startup lazy or startup lai, what is it? So I'm going to define it here as any project that's designed to scale rapidly and is sustainable. So that involves hockey stick growth. And if you don't know what a hockey stick is, it's like this. I know that the weather isn't great in Vietnam for hockey. Typically, there's external funding from venture capitalists, starting with angel investors and moving on in a series of rounds. It's not like other kinds of investments. They're looking for at least a 10x return at minimum. A great example of a startup is a software company. And typically they ask, is there a better way to do this? Or is there some unfair advantage or some extraordinary technology that they're using in order to provide a better experience for users? It is not a coffee shop. I know in Vietnam, the term startup is used for any new business. I don't want to encourage, or I don't want to discourage people from being entrepreneurs, but the needs of a coffee shop are very different from the needs of a software company in terms of growth. One exception, you could look at Starbucks as a startup because of how much it's grown since inception. And so doing a startup or joining a startup is a specific kind of entrepreneurship, not better or worse than any other kind of entrepreneurship. It really depends on what you're looking for in terms of life goals. Obviously, if you have a family and children, your priorities are going to be a bit different than if you're a fresh graduate and you have a lot of free time, or you have a lot of time to contribute towards the growth and development of a startup. And I should also note that a very small percentage of all companies in any economy are considered a startup. They do have disproportionate interest and attention. So something like 97% of companies in an economy are SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. So really, my book should have been called SME Vietnam, not Startup Vietnam. But I'll also get into that as to why I chose the title and how that helps to update a bit the more accurate perception of what's happening in Vietnam. So as we start to dive a bit deeper into the presentation, I want you to think of Vietnam as a brand. So if you Google Vietnam, what's the first thing that comes up on Google search results? Or if you were to ask somebody, what do you think of when you think of Vietnam? It's going to depend, depending on where they're from and how old they are. And I think that's that's in some ways a bit of an uphill battle, especially if you're traveling from Vietnam on the outside, and sometimes you get some funny questions, or for example, if you're an international student in the US, du học sinh, and you get asked questions partly out of curiosity and partly out of naivete. But then, you know, it also encompasses the kind of content online that you can find. So videos on YouTube, whether they're from backpackers or vloggers or BQ who are visiting or living there, photos and kinds of articles that you'd find in, for example, New York Times or the Washington Post. The interesting feedback too is from foreigners in Vietnam, people who have had the opportunity to look at Vietnam up close, so to speak, and to observe, of course, through their own eyes, their own biases. I have my own biases as well. And then perspectives from the global Vietnamese diaspora, which is not a monolith. There are, of course, communities of Vietnamese diaspora in the US, in Australia, in Germany, and even places like Canada. Actually, in February, I went to eat at a Vietnamese restaurant in Mexico City, and the owner was from Hanoi, and he was very happy to hear some Vietnamese, and I was very happy to practice some of my Vietnamese with him. And then also feedback from other Southeast Asians who are right in the neighborhood. They, of course, have an interesting perspective because they're also part of Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And they've seen Vietnam, I think, develop in a pretty rapidly, developed pretty rapidly, I should say, in a short amount of time. These are all perceptions, ideas, sentiments that are collectively held about Vietnam. And so, you know, that's the brand. Kind of like if you were to think, you know, what do you think about Germany when you hear the word Germany, or the US, for example? And of course, there's going to be some good and bad and in between. So the other term that I want to define is what do we mean by regional? Are we talking about ASEAN? We're talking about Southeast Asia. So Vietnam is technically part of mainland Southeast Asia, or the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. We're talking about Asia Pacific, which encompasses regions of Asia, or Indo-Pacific, which has, of course, increased in popularity as a term since 2016. So I'm going to be using Southeast Asia as a region. And if not, then I'm going to note it. But the bottom line is the world is a small place, right? And if you've traveled, you'll be surprised who you run into or where people have been and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, so now zooming into a bit more on the topic and what's happening in Vietnam as it relates to startups and tech. No surprise that there's an influx of startups and tech companies coming to Vietnam. For example, in terms of ride sharing, Grab, Gojek, Uber. Of course, you know, that's changed a bit, and there have been some new entrants in the past 3 years, but they see value in coming to Vietnam. And at the same time, there's value in being an outsider. You look at things differently. Perhaps you don't see all the reasons why something wouldn't work. And that's an advantage in some ways, looking at things with a fresh perspective. I always took the opportunity to seek out foreigners in Vietnam who had been there with less time than I had been there, because after a while, things that surprise you or shock you even, they become normalized. So it's good to always get a sense of what's what's something that's extraordinary, but then can perhaps become ordinary in that sense. So at the same time, and especially since 2013, when I moved to Saigon, there's more startup interest in Vietnam. The level of sophistication of founders is increasing. There's, of course, more interest from regional investors. I remember meeting VC investors who said it's getting harder to source deals in Indonesia and Singapore, and that's why they were coming to Vietnam, and that was 3 years ago. And I think with the founder sophistication, there are more resources available than ever online, which means basically all you need is a way to consume it. So a smartphone or a laptop and an internet connection, or even Twitter for that matter. You can really connect to anyone in the world who's on there. At the same time, there are a variety of programs to help build capacity in Vietnam for entrepreneurs and founders. IBP 2 was one example of that. And I should note that at the same time, the public sector is setting a more stable foundation. That's, of course, a great step in the right direction. I think largely it's a reaction to the interest in the private sector around these topics and themes. But of course, public sector sort of sets a table, so to speak, regulations, clarity, so that you can figure out what are the requirements, and hopefully to enforce a level playing field, whether you're a local entrepreneur or a foreign founder. And the most important thing about what's happening in Vietnam is that the entrepreneurs are at the heart of the ecosystem. So if it were not for the entrepreneur, nothing else would really happen. And Vietnam is not so different from a lot of developing markets in the sense that there's talent everywhere. It's the opportunities that are lacking. And you can go to any number of countries and see that, especially the sort of practical innovation examples thereof of people getting by, right? Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. And at the same time, Vietnamese companies are either looking to go global or regional, or they're seeking out users outside of Vietnam. I think perhaps the best example, or the most well-known example, is VNG. They've been on a long journey since 2004. In 2017, they announced their intention to IPO in the US. And they're a pioneer, of course. They have more dominated nationally than expanded regionally. And I think on the other hand, Topica EdTech Group, they've provided e-learning, online learning platforms for several Southeast Asian nations. Of course, with the COVID-19 situation, it's seen a big increase in popularity and necessity as well, especially for any number of schools that have paused or have shut down temporarily. Flappy Bird is a great example of a Vietnamese tech product that gained global notoriety or global fame back in 2014. And when I was in Egypt, I asked the audience there, like, who's heard of Flappy Bird? And a whole bunch of people raised their hands. And I had developed by a Vietnamese engineer. And not a lot of folks knew that, but it was a turning point, I would say, in the community. Now, well, back then, I should say, people could see that you could actually earn a living from making games and developing projects independently. Design Bold is a more recent company. It's providing services for design, as the name implies, similar to Canva, but their whole approach was targeting foreigners from the beginning. And Elsa, an English language speech assistant, was founded by Vietnamese in California. And so this is another model. Instead of setting up in Vietnam and targeting users outside, go outside and look at the market, which is people who want to pronounce English better. So those are some examples of different ways that Vietnam-based startups and techs have approached going outside of Vietnam. So for the audience, is it as simple as what should you pick? Should you pick national? Should you pick regional? Should you use your local knowledge as an advantage? And that's a pretty big advantage. It was the case when I was in Vietnam, and I remember hearing Vietnamese industry leaders at events saying that Vietnamese should absolutely use their local knowledge and use that as an advantage over foreign companies. Now, I would say that it really depends on what you mean by local knowledge. The knowledge of relationships is shifting a bit to knowledge of information, and it's unclear if that's still as much as an advantage as it was a few years ago, and certainly 10 or 15 years ago, because Vietnam is now more open as an economy, and there are different requirements, of course, in terms of what Vietnam as an economy integrated into the global economy can and can't do. One of the reasons that is often cited for going regional in Southeast Asia is the larger market opportunity, right? So in Vietnam, the population is just under 100 million, whereas if you're targeting Southeast Asia or ASEAN, we're talking about 630 million people, which sounds great, except for the fact that there are at least 10 different markets, and the languages are different and the culture is different. And one of my favorite quotes is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So what does that mean then for you? Like, should you do both? Should you dominate nationally and then expand regionally? And what about going global? Isn't that at the top of a lot of folks talking about post-pandemic? Are we going to see globalization 2.0, for example? But I think more importantly, it really depends on if you're going to follow the headlines or the trend lines. And what I mean by that is, if you see that Startup X raised a round of funding, and then you say, hey, that validates that there's something there, that's certainly one way to go after building a startup. But then also the trend lines is taking a step back and asking, okay, like, what is this industry going to look like in 5 years? What's lacking here? A lot of questions, and I think one of the most common questions that's asked in Vietnam is, what if I fail? And to that, I think the response should be, what if you succeed? Right? I mean, especially if, as I mentioned earlier, you're a fresh graduate and you're either learning the ropes or you're very early into your career. The sooner that you start getting practice doing things, the more quickly you can get up to speed and eventually succeed. But it's not an overnight success, so to speak. So taking all these different themes and questions into play, you're going to assess whether to go regional or national. You know, where is Vietnam today? And one of my other favorite quotes is, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed, right? So thinking about the media that exists around Vietnam and Vietnam in the world, I think a lot of folks, if they are following Vietnam, certainly the talking heads and the pundits, there's some coverage on Vietnam being the president of the United Nations Security Council, 2021, peacekeeping missions in South Sudan and Central African Republic. I think a lot of folks, especially foreigners, when they think of Vietnam, they think of garments and textiles. For example, the shirt I'm wearing was made in Vietnam. My Chuck Taylors were made in Vietnam. I have a Samsung smartphone. There's a good chance it was assembled in Vietnam. So, you know, suits, sneakers, smartphones. I think the most common response, at least in the US, when Vietnam comes up is, oh, I love pho. That's usually what people tell me when Vietnam comes up. And, you know, again, in terms of an American or US-centric perspective, there's largely focused on the politics and 20th century events between Vietnam and the US, which really brings me to a question, like, are foreigners familiar with modern Vietnam, especially those who have never visited or they never lived in Vietnam? That's not only for Westerners, Southeast Asians as well. You know, what's their impression of Vietnam? I think depending on the country, there's different levels of awareness and knowledge. So for Vietnam in the region, you know, it's currently the chair of ASEAN, and it's known as the older brother, right? Younger brother being Laos. There's a strong affection for Singapore. I never really heard Indonesia mentioned at all when I was in Vietnam, which is surprising when you consider that it's half the economic output of ASEAN and it has a population of 265 million people, right? So just based on sheer size, it's an economic juggernaut, right? So you'd imagine there's going to be a lot of competition emerging from Indonesia in either the same or similar spaces. Could be complementary spaces as well. And then Philippines is also often compared to Vietnam, similar population size, and the only notable exception would be the outsourcing industry and the level of English, I'd say. And Vietnam, along with Philippines and Indonesia, is well known for its infrastructure investments, which see all across the country, in the north and in the south, the Japanese and Korean and Chinese and French back, depending on what kind of infrastructure project it is. So then ultimately is Vietnam known as a startup hub in the region? And I'd say that's truer today than it was 5 years ago. I think a lot of folks, especially from Singapore, are starting to note what's happening in Vietnam, or they've already been aware of what's happening to Vietnam, and they've been visiting, and they've been trying to source teams and deals in Vietnam for some years. The narrative takes some time to catch up to reality, and then it also takes some time, even if you're seeing it firsthand, to put the pieces together to figure out, okay, is this a trend? Is there something there? And then also, what's the perception of Vietnam at home? So for example, if you're Hanoian, are you going to think the same thing about Vietnam as if you're from Da Nang? And one of the things that really sort of made an impression on me, and one of the reasons why I wanted to go to Hanoi, spend more time there, is because when I used to live in Saigon, there was always this kind of advice that I would get, you know, to be careful up in Hanoi. And when I went up there, I had a great time. And when I went back, I would ask people like, hey, you know, like, when's the last time you went to Hanoi? Like, I went one weekend some years ago. And you ask foreigners who are giving the same advice, like, when's the last time you were in Hanoi? Like, oh, I never went because my friends here told me there was no need to go. So it's really interesting, the differences. And although you know, most of my time was spent in urban areas, urban centers in Vietnam, it's very easy to forget that the majority of Vietnamese live outside of these urban centers, right? So like what you see in Hanoi or in Ho Chi Minh City is not really indicative of the whole country. So, you know, if you're Vietnamese and you have one perception of another city, are you really accurate in your thinking about, one, that city, and two, about the country? So ultimately, does your idea of Vietnam depend on where you were born in Vietnam, and how does that play into whether you want to go national or whether you want to go regional, right? So here you go. Like, what are the chances that your assumptions about Vietnam are accurate, the region are accurate, and the world are accurate? It depends. I mean, travel certainly is a great equalizer. If you meet a lot of people from different places, that certainly helps as well. If you've traveled around Vietnam, if you've lived in different places in Vietnam, I think that helps to hone in a more accurate reflection. But again, depends on your own biases, right? And I have my own biases as well. For my book, I decided to lean into them instead of trying to like. So ultimately, whether you want to go national or you want to go regional, it depends on like how you want to position yourself. If you have a startup, your startup as well, and it really boils down to vision or question, right? So, do you have a clear vision of what the world is going to be like, or what the region's going to be like, or what Vietnam's going to be like in 5 years? And do you see where you fit into that vision? Or are you starting from a question and saying like, how can this be made better? Or what's this industry going to look like in the next 5 years? Or what's a vision that I can fit myself into, whether it's as a contributor or whether it's as founder? My point is, before you decide one way or another, you better understand, or you should understand better before acting. And what's the best way to do that? Is it by staying at home? Well, now is kind of a unique time period, right? Because depending on where you are in the world, you should stay at home, at least until the pandemic wave has subsided. Or should you go out into the world and question what you believe or your beliefs by challenging them? That's, I think, one way to approach it. It's certainly more feasible to do the same with your own community, right? Who knows the community better than you do, especially if you've been living in the same community for an extended period of time. And at the same time, you know, really, does this process start with yourself, right? You know, taking an introspective look and seeing, you know, what do you offer as a founder or entrepreneur or co-founder? What's unique about you? what value add can you deliver that is differentiated, right? And here's another quote: "You must be the change you wish to see in the world. You got to start with yourself for a lot of stuff." So, you know, in many ways, top of mind differentiation is in a way like thinking, okay, when someone thinks about who would be great for this project, they think of you, or who can, who do we need to help, and your name comes up. So you want to get into that position whereby people associate you with something that you're better than most people at. And I think one way for you to start developing that, to getting top of mind, is by sharing stories. Why? Because we remember stories. We recall things that stand out, right? So not run-of-the-mill situations. We really revere people who make it a positive impact on us. We also remember people who are, not so nice to us as well. And as humans, we record our histories via stories, right? People have been gathering around fires for generations, telling stories, passing on oral histories from generation to generation. And I think this is really important, this next part. If you don't share your story, then somebody else will tell your story for you, right? So if you think like, oh, I'm just normal, or I don't have an opinion, or whatever the case, which I often heard a lot in Vietnam, then you're basically giving power to somebody else to impress or imprint whatever they want on you, because if you don't have an opinion, then it doesn't matter, right? They can say whatever they want, or create any narrative. So, if you are happy with the narrative, which is whatever you think, when you think of Vietnam, when you think of Asia, when you think of your hometown, for example, then you can keep moving along, basically. But I think there's an opportunity, especially now, which I'm going to get into a bit later, to kind of update the narrative, especially when, frankly, a lot of other countries should be doing much better jobs handling the pandemic. So the world has changed a lot since the beginning of the 21st century. And because I'm from the US has changed a lot too since 2016, which was the last election year. I want you guys to think about what Vietnam's going to be like in 2030, a decade from now, and what can you start this year or next year and wrap up in 5 years, or be halfway to a 10-year project. I guess in Vietnam, it would be 2 5-year plans, right? If we're talking about a decade. And so I think right now, Vietnam's response to COVID-19 is a watershed moment. To date, there have been 0 deaths. The response overall has been great, this first wave, and a lot of people have noticed. I was just on a webinar last night, thanks to the Vietnam Finance Society, and it came up, this is really an impressive response by the Vietnamese government. What's left to be determined is how Vietnam handled the second and third waves, which will probably come. But it's a great head start, so to speak. And here's one data set which shows that the number of COVID-19 tests per per confirmed case, and this is as recent as 2 or 3 days ago, depending on where you are. I'm 12 hours behind everyone in Vietnam by yesterday. And you can see clearly, Vietnam is the clear leader here in a positive aspect. And I think that surprised a lot of people. I think there was a lot of hesitation around covering it, around reporting it, because it was unknown. You know, is this accurate? How can it be that Vietnam is handling the pandemic much better than countries that we expect, that we take for granted, are prepared and responsive to an emergency? So, in terms of this opportunity for changing narratives for Vietnam, ultimately, you know, what does this mean for you, right? You can either like ride the wave, so look at growth areas in Vietnam, education, healthcare, figure out ways to innovate it, and then also look at growth areas in the region that have overlap in Vietnam, for example, infrastructure, real estate, whether it's prop tech, or it's another way to innovate in either industry. The important thing is that there are many challenges in Vietnam. Someone or many people will have to come up with solutions, and that's not a bad thing, because there are opportunities within the challenges, right? That means that in Vietnam is not the only country in the world to be experiencing climate change. Vietnam is not the only country in the world to have, for example, lack of transparency. It's a global phenomenon. It's just more sophisticated in other places. So if Vietnamese pioneer the technology, pioneer solutions, for example, for climate change, that's directly benefiting the country, and the tech or innovations can be licensed or exported abroad. Of course, you have to respect for intellectual property, but the challenges that Vietnam is facing aren't unique. It's just going to be among the first countries to experience the impacts of climate change, for example. And that's what I mean, that there are the opportunities within the challenges, because Vietnam is at the forefront. And so that's in some ways an advantage, because there's no other choice. Figure out how to address the growing climate crisis, for example. And in my book, I outline a host of other industries and areas that I think are ripe starting points for entrepreneurs and founders. And then on the topic of COVID-19, rebuilding the world after the pandemic. So what does that look like? Well, you know, things are returning to normal first, or a new normal first, in Asia, places like Vietnam. So you have the opportunity to set an example for the rest of the world, right? Because, for example, in New York, it looks like the peak has passed, but they haven't yet opened up, which is the same case in many states in the US. So I know that Saigon opened up on Friday, and that's an opportunity to show the whole world, like, you know, what does it look like in terms of interacting with people, things we took for granted before, are we going to do away with? You know, like handshakes, hugs, kissing greetings. It's also largely cultural as well, right? You know, here in Mexico, everyone greets each other with like 3 different handshakes and kisses on the cheek. You know, that doesn't happen in Vietnam. The point is, of course, when you're closer to people, there's more risk for infection or contamination. But I think ask yourself, you know, is this the opportunity to change some things? What does it look like, the transition as the whole world goes from before coronavirus to after coronavirus? And more broadly, what is next for Vietnam, right? What is Vietnam going to be associated with in this century, in the 21st century? And I think that's a departure from what Vietnam was associated with in the last century. This is this is a century full of a lot of transitions, and some of them are positive, some of them are painful. It depends what part of the world you're in. But ultimately, the future of Vietnam is up to you, and by you I mean the Vietnamese who are watching this. So really, it comes down to two questions: you want to be part of it, and can you afford not to be part of it? This is, in many ways, a once-in-a-lifetime transformation. What's happening in Vietnam in terms of unlocking wealth, unlocking value, unlocking opportunities here. Well, there in Vietnam, I should say. And I also want to be careful because I never really like to give recommendations about when it comes to Vietnam. Why? Because I don't really have to live with the recommendations, and so that's why I don't like to give them when it comes to Vietnam specifically. There's a report called Vietnam 2035, which is both in English and Vietnamese. If you want some starting points to try and picture and imagine what's going to happen in 2035, it takes a pretty frank look at Vietnam. The report came out in 2016, I believe, with the World Bank and the government of Vietnam. I think we're only going to see deepening and increasing cooperation with other countries, Vietnam and other countries, that is, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Australia, Finland, and the US as well. That's a relationship. Well, they're all relationships that have deepened, at least since I was in Vietnam and I saw what was happening, but also among ASEAN. ASEAN is an important body in not only the region but the world. And I think this century, now that we're a fifth of the way into it, it really offers the opportunity for Vietnam to craft a new image for itself, or at least to cut strings with the remnants of what people think of or perceive Vietnam to be, which of course is largely wrapped in time. So some takeaways. Vietnam and ASEAN will grow in importance, whether we're talking about regional cooperation or supply chains. I know, again, the webinar last night, there was comments about how the supply chains are impacted elsewhere because things had slowed down in Vietnam, and, for example, manufacturers needed a part that was not available. The same is happening here in Mexico as well, because there's a stagger in the pandemic. Things here are closed they close at a later date than in the US, so there's pressure to reopen so that US manufacturers can have access to the components and parts that are produced here, that are sent there, that are necessary for the supply chain. But ASEAN will also grow in importance, US, and that's because of demographics. There is a significant portion of Asian Americans, and a portion of those Asian Americans identify as Southeast Asian. Followed the US presidential election this year, you might have noticed that there was the first serious contender, an Asian American for president, Andrew Yang. And there's a lot of interest from the diaspora back into the home country, or the ancestral country where people have their roots. And that's one way that the ties will be deepened in the U.S. and it's important to remember that Vietnam has only been really open since 1994. So I think for a lot of people in Vietnam who don't have exposure or experience with foreigners, they're under the impression that the way things operate in Vietnam is the way things are done. It's not the case if you've been abroad, for example. And again, this COVID-19, one of the few silver linings is that Vietnam has another opportunity to kind of demonstrate to the world that they're up to it, in a sense. They have what it takes to manage a crisis. Of course, it's not the first time you had the bird flu, H1N1 experiences in Vietnam, which I think is one of the advantages that Asian countries had in this pandemic, is that they had experience. They saw more directly the damage, the impact that previous outbreak, and so they were more prepared, or they took it. And above all, get involved. Take a look for yourself to see what's happening in your community, and figure out what you want to do, or if you don't, try a whole bunch of things. And some ways to get involved, if you're at the very beginning of your entrepreneurial journey and you're in Hanoi, check out Nomads Hanoi. They run a great program for folks who want to better connect with their inner entrepreneur, and I guarantee you're gonna come away with some lifelong friends. I had the pleasure of sitting in on some of their sessions and speaking with one of the original founders. Really wonderful to see the kind of development for young folks up in Hanoi. If you're in Saigon, send them an email, I guess, and ask them to come to Saigon and set up something in Saigon or in another city in Vietnam. Vietnam Finance Society, they're a great resource if you're a finance professional, or if you're interested in startups, or if you have any sort of interest in connecting with Vietnamese groups overseas. They're based in New York and co-based in Singapore now. And as I mentioned, they had a webinar last night, so it's a great resource to check out. There's a group called Overseas Vietnamese. If you go to overseasvietnamese.org, you can, or check out Overseas Vietnamese on LinkedIn. There's another group to connect with the global diaspora. If you're in the UK, VietPro. I have spoken to either all the founders of these organizations or the current managers, and they're all welcoming and open to connecting. And if you don't ask, the answer is always no, right? And as I said, the world is a small place. If you're in Vietnam now, go check out some co-working spaces. Each one has a different community. Go to some events, meet people, practice your story, what it is that you're trying to accomplish, what it is you're curious about. I don't go begging for a job. Tell them what projects you're interested in working on, or ask them what they're working on, and then suggest ways that you can be a valuable member of their team. If you'd like to stay in touch with me after this webinar, you can find me on Facebook, so facebook.com/Andrew P. Rowan Official, on Twitter at Mr. Rowan. My website is www.andrewprowan.com. You can check out my podcast. The very first episode is on Vietnam, actually, because I met up with a friend, a Hanoian friend in Lima, who was getting ready to relocate back to Hanoi. And we had a nice chat about some stuff. And she's currently in Saigon, working there. And there's a copy of my book. If you email me, the first 10 people who email me, I'll send you a free copy of my book. So that's my email address under the book. And with that, I want to thank Debbie and Lan Anh for their help and support for making this webinar happen. Of course, I also want to thank Chin Han Futures Lab for this opportunity, for having invited me as a guest speaker. And now I'd like to open it up to questions.
Andrew, thank you so much for your excellent speech and your offer to all students to get the free copy of your book. And I believe that they will be very interested in that. And now, so before coming to the Q&A session, I would like to announce one good question that had been selected by our last speaker, Dr. Klingler Vitra, which is the asset strategy planning required from all VCs? Could you please share some tips for asset strategy planning? Thank you so much. Congratulations to Ms. Linh Nguyen, and we'll contact you soon for delivering our gift to you. So for today, we look forward to receiving more great questions from all attendees, and the reward for the best question today will be selected from our speaker, Mr. Rowan, and we'll announce on the next session. For the first question I received, this is the first one from Ms. Thảo Anh Lê. What are the key differential characters of startup and SME or other micro business?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the key differences, of course, is the growth between a startup and an SME. For startups, it's like a rocket ship. The growth, whether it's users or revenue, the point is to grow as fast as possible. Although in recent years, that's shifted a bit to as sustainably as possible, especially if you look at some examples of the most notable being WeWork, and how the focus was on growth at all costs, as opposed to having sustainable growth, right? For SMEs, it can be any number of businesses, right? It can be a pharmacy, it can be a coffee shop, it can be even a hair salon, right? So this is like what you would call a brick and mortar. Of course, the meaning is that there's a physical space, physical location. Well, not necessarily. You also have, what are called lifestyle businesses, or location independent entrepreneurs, digital nomads, people who they earn on the internet, right? It's digital marketing, or ways of affiliate marketing, and then micro enterprises. It really depends on that. Usually informal, and that's always a big challenge. Is the number of informal workers and the informal businesses in an economy, especially if the state is trying to collect revenue, right? You basically balance a budget if not everyone pays their fair share, for example. And again, these are not unique to Vietnam. So, in Peru, the vast majority of companies there were SMEs. They called them pymes, and then equally, or I should also say another portion were micro enterprises, which were called MIPES. So, this is one aspect that is transferable to other economies. Um, I hope I answered your question. If you have a follow-up, please send me an email.
Andrew. And the next question is, how do you think, how will the Vietnamese startup ecosystem be impacted by COVID-19? How do you think, how it changed the startup ecosystem?
Well, I think in many ways it's going to be impacted, or it has been impacted the same way that other places have, right? So people are discouraged from meeting in person or events. There's been this gigantic shift to digital, Zoom, for example, webinars. I was joking with somebody that there are too many webinars these days. And here we are, right? So I think those are the more direct impacts. I don't know yet what travel is going to look like. There used to be groups of investors, VCs, who would come from Singapore to Vietnam for events. I don't know if they're willing to risk, or if in general business travel has changed, because it's been halted, like worldwide. So, on one hand, you can arguably justify essential business travel, but if you haven't been doing that for 3 months, it's a bit harder to convince people to go back to the old ways, right? Especially if there are other alternatives. I don't know if Zoom is an alternative for in-person meetings. I don't think you can have the same rapport, and there's no substitute for face-to-face interaction in some places, parts of Asia included. So that'll be interesting to see. But I think the other big impact is, of course, drop in customers, drop in users, right? There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of economic pain all over the world. And, it's going to be hard. Like, for example, the US, if you're talking about 30 million people who lost their jobs last weeks, their disposable income drops, right? I don't think the economic impact is severe in Vietnam. I've heard reports, anecdotally, from friends who went to the gym. So basically, it looks like how it was before the pandemic. So, I think it'll certainly be more difficult to connect with people in person. People are going to think twice before going to a happy hour or going to a meeting, unless they know that everyone around them has been vetted and they've declared their health status, and it's okay. So again, if I didn't answer your question fully, or you have a follow-up, please send me an email.
Okay, so as you see that like under the situation of COVID-19, a lot of healthcare startup is raising up. So do you think it will keep raised up in the next 1 or 2 years, or for the long term, or it's just a short trend under the hard situation like now?
Yeah, so I don't see the situation really going away until we have a vaccine that's distributed en masse. So there's widespread distribution of the vaccine. And that can take anywhere from 12 to 18 months or longer, from what I've read and what I've heard. In the meantime, the next best option is testing and tracing. And there's some, I think, controversy over the reliability of the test. So, you know, no one wants to be sick. If you don't have your health, you don't have anything else. If you can't take care of yourself, then you can't take care of anything else. So, you know, it's a vital priority. So any way that you can de-risk or identify or preempt infected, or if you can stop or lessen or dampen the next pandemic, the next outbreak, I think we're going to see some changes. One example in terms of how things change would be, you know, what's the response in terms of airport security after a major event like the one in 2001 in New York, September 11th. Those impacts are still felt today in that industry. I don't think any government wants to see a repeat of what we've seen since November. And I think for many of them, it's going to be a top priority, both the public and the private sector, to stave that off before the ball gets rolling to the same point as it's been with this COVID-19.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. And the next question is, how do you think, like, is it possible to build a startup that targeting to another market, not the location that we are based on? For example, we target on Singapore market as the first market from our Vietnam office. Like, any advantage or disadvantage?
Well, I think it really depends on whatever product or service that you're selling. On one hand, initially, it looks like you might not be able to connect with customers, not in person as easily. But if you're doing everything online, then that could be one way to address the lack of perceived customer discovery and customer feedback. At the same time, I don't see any reason why you can't sell to another geographic location other than where you are, as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you've done the research and you're able to connect with the market. So yeah, I don't think it'll be held back unless it's specifically for industries, whether you need a local on the ground presence or regulations or rules that prohibit you from operating offshore, like the example.
So comparing to the other regional ecosystems, how developed Vietnam till now?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, so comparing to the other regional markets, how developed Vietnam's right now? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, in general terms, Singapore is still the financial hub of Southeast Asia, and they've had a head start of sorts, needs and startups 8 or 9 years ago. So that being said, I think Vietnam has turned a lot of heads in the last few years, especially because when people hear about Vietnam now, it contrasts so much with their impression of Vietnam from the last century. In regards to other ecosystems, I'm quite interested in the Indonesian startup ecosystem because of, as I mentioned, for the population size, its economic output. I think there are elements of cooperation and competition in ASEAN, especially when you look at the challenges across the different economies, right? So I I can't really talk too much about Vietnam in comparison to the Philippines or to another economy. And frankly, sometimes the comparisons aren't apt. You know, if you look at, for example, Cambodia, Myanmar, or Laos, although I've been to some of those countries, I don't know much in terms of experience as I do with Vietnam. So I think Vietnam in general is heading in the right direction. And a lot of people, if they go to Vietnam, they can feel what's happening there, just as I felt it. That's a very common anecdote about feeling that energy, the electricity, the excitement in Vietnam. And I think it's a matter of formalizing or diverting those energies, building into creating. Humans were meant to create, and entrepreneurship is just one form.
So, many people think that Vietnam is highly relationship-based, and building a close relationship with the clients is critical to success. So, how do you think about that, and how is different from the other regional markets?
Well, I'll answer the first question. It's still very relationship based in Vietnam. Who you know, and who's the son or daughter of whom. But if you're going regional as opposed to going national, if you go through Singapore, there are a lot of VCs that have network connections in the region who can help. People want to help. People want to help, whether or not they're investors. You'd be surprised. Again, if you don't ask for help, the answer is no. It might not be the kind of help that you want. It might not be the help that you're looking for, but people want to help, especially in my own experience, the Vietnamese diaspora. Segments of them, portions of them are looking for ways. That's based on experiences speaking with Vietnamese diaspora members from Australia, from Germany, from the US. And I think also non-Vietnamese want to help as well for a variety of reasons. So that's one disadvantage potentially if you stay in Vietnam, unless you have the relationships. And then, that's your advantage at that
point. And I think this is the last question from today, from Mr. Lê Trọng Hiếu. As we know that US, Europe, and Japan has relocated their companies out of China to avoid China manipulation. Is it a chance for Vietnam to attract this company, and which we should prepare to take this chance, and any industry we should invest on? How do you think about that?
Well, I think there's been a lot of interest in general relocating supply chains out of China in other places like Vietnam, for example. It's not so easy just picking up and dropping in, but the reason why there's been interest over, say, the long term, more than a year, is because of the trade war with the so-called trade war with US and China, Arabs. And the person who asked the question is right, is that there is a shift out of China. And I think this situation with COVID-19 only exacerbates the relationship between China and the US. In terms of Vietnam, well, that's certainly an opportunity for Vietnam. As I said,
it's not so easy just picking up and dropping in portions of the supply chain. And I think the major bottleneck is lack of skilled labor in productivity rates relative to other countries in Southeast Asia are still low, and including when you compare Vietnamese worker productivity with other workers such as Chinese workers. That's an issue that has to be addressed and is being addressed along the way in terms of building capacity. And then in terms of the last question about investments, was it investments in supply chains or just in general investments in Vietnam? Could you clarify that, the last question, please?
The question is like how we can prepare to take the chance that to receiving more investment from the company from US, Europe, and Japan to like come into Vietnam, and like which industry
I see.
you think we should invest?
I see. Well, in general terms, I would say that the students of today are the workers of tomorrow. And so if you're not preparing your students to be competitive, so if you're not challenging them to think critically, if you're not encouraging them to be creative, if you're not helping them to be confident in their ability to ask clarifying questions, I think you're only hurting the future of the potential of the workforce or the country itself. So there are a host of concerns that foreign companies have when it comes to Vietnam. I would say that the Vietnamese government is responsive to some of those concerns, and they are taking the steps necessary to address them. I think we have different time horizons for a lot of stuff, but then you know, it's I think a different perspective and different KPIs, key performance indicators, that people in the public sector have as opposed to the private sector. And in terms of investments, well, I would look at areas that are currently in niche, but have the potential to go mainstream in 3 to 5 years. That means basically talking to people. I don't know if the questioner is there on the ground in Vietnam. If he is, I would ask this person to observe what they see and what's missing, especially if they've traveled or if they have plans to travel, because that's a great way. When you go to a new place, you see what they have here that we should have back home, and vice versa. What do we have back home that they should have here? And that's how you're able to spot opportunities. And also, if you have a problem yourself, you come up with a solution, do some research and see if other people have the same problem, and if there's enough of a market opportunity there for you to advance.
Thank you, Andrew. So I think we have come to the end of our session today. So on behalf of our attendees and the program, thank you, Mr. Andrew Rowan, for making time to join with us. Especially, I know that this is your like Saturday evening, so thank you so much for making time to join us and to share your expertise and experience in this field.
Well, it was a pleasure to spend my Saturday evening with you all. I hope you all learned something, and I hope that more importantly, you go out and do something.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for your encouragement to all the attendees. Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I know that this is the Sunday weekend, and so we really appreciate for your participation with us today. And before saying goodbye, I would like to announce our next session on Wednesday with Mr. Wally Chaker from Finland. He will give us a talk about how to do pitching And Walid believes that pitching is similar to riding a bike or swimming. Everyone can learn it, and his wish is to inspire people to adopt pitching and networking as early as possible because those skills are crucial for your success in the future. So we look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy your Sunday. Thank you, Andrew.
Bye-bye. Have a
Bye,
nice
Andrew.
weekend, everybody. Take care.